Welcome to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, would Dave Ramsey crash the economy? Tim.
If you live in America and make the mistake of leaving AM radio on your car, sometimes you'll hear Dave Ramsey's call-in financial advice show. Now, I'm not going to crap totally on Dave Ramsey. That's not the per se the intent of the episode. Although I do want to make Dave Ramsey and his devotees to think more clearly about the economy in more theoretical terms. So a lot of Dave Ramsey's advice he'll give: avoiding credit card debt, avoiding car loans, trying to buy things in cash, saving money, trashing university debt, not buying $6 coffees and getting coffee at home, cooking meals at home instead of going out to eat. I'm not against any of those advice, and I think in isolation, any one of those pieces of advice are good. The problem is, and I think this is sort of the existential both existential philosophical as well as macroeconomic problem with Dave Ramsey's advice, is it doesn't scale, and if it does scale, it scales in such a way that would crash the fiat economy. So I've included a quote from Nietzsche: "If we have our own way of life, we shall get along with almost any how. Man does not strive for pleasure, only the Englishman does." And I think the striving for pleasure is to some extent what capitalism is, striving for pleasure. What the current now Austrian economics, which represents Mises, Hayek, Hoppe, Rothbard. And then we have Keynesian economics, and like neoliberal economics. These are sort of broad schools of economics here. Whatever you want to call our current existent system, you want to call it neoliberalism, you want to call it capitalism, you want to call it consumerism. That's the thing we live under. And people in this system, people pursue pleasure at its core. That's what people do. So if you think on the supply side, why do people buy things? Like, why in the world do people buy houses? Why do people buy pool tables? Why do people buy pools, decks, vacations to Rome, vacations to Disney World, etc.? We don't live in the pre-modern economy. We're not merely laboring 80 hours a week just to feed ourselves, or 40 hours a week, whatever, to feed ourselves. That's the first macroeconomic thing that's different about the predecessor cultures, the pre-modern, pre-industrial culture, and our current society / culture. So we're not strictly laboring for our needs, and even things like healthcare. If you look at a lot of healthcare spending, this is for things that didn't exist, and if they did exist, they were extremely expensive in years past, or they exist to fix problems that only exist in modernity, like diabetes, possibly. There's certain diseases of overabundance that could exist in modernity that would never have existed in pre-modernity. But so when people call into Dave Ramsey's advice, and they had, some of these cases are total basket cases, and like Dave's advice is sound. If you're in debt, stop going out to eat and just cook food at home. The problem is, if everyone does this, and this is to me the brilliance of Keynes. Sorry, Austrians. Is to understand this sort of core problem of collapse of spending will lead to crises. Now, to some extent, the question is, will it lead to crises? And I think there's a moral dimension too underneath here at work at play, which is Dave Ramsey thinks it's stupid to pay interest on things, which I agree. I agree, Dave. The problem is, one of the ways Dave Ramsey accumulates wealth, I'll say rent plus interest. One of the ways Dave Ramsey accumulates wealth, money making money. So Dave Ramsey's advice is, don't buy that $6 coffee. Make your coffee at home for 1/6 the cost. Put that money into a mutual fund and have that money earn money. Much better way. Much more rational way to do it. Now, as been pointed out by those are the more left-wing Christians, there is a contradiction of saying earning interest is dumb, yet earning interest. There is a sort of first-hand hypocrisy there. Saying renting is bad, yet then renting out properties or forcing people to forcing, I'm using scare quotes, there, why do people have to rent? Why can't people own? So my point here of Dave Ramsey's advice is not to crap on any individual piece of advice. It's just to say that a lot of his advice misses the broader macroeconomic picture, or engages in the very thing that Dave Ramsey is against. So, like, why do people have jobs as doctors? Why do people have jobs as working at being managers at theme parks, or managers at arcades, or managers at, or workers or owners of restaurants? If Dave Ramsey says buying a $6 coffee is a bad idea, how exactly are people supposed to go up and open restaurants? How exactly are people to go up and open bike shops or motorcycle shops? If people, if Dave Ramsey is going to say you don't need that extra pool or you don't need that motorcycle, that's to some extent what the modern economy is. Parents spend a lot of money saving up for college. I think college is sort of like this sort of weird good, but like it's sort of a consumer good in the sense that parents like build for it. They work extra hours. It's just so they're, or kids in America will take out lots of debt and they'll pay it off so they get the experience. But it's in that sense, it's like a consumer good. It's like paying off a vacation or something like that. If you take these things away, all these things that Dave Ramsey recommends, where would the economy go? Like if everyone stopped, this is where, to me, on a logical level, Keynes understands the problem. So this is to some extent a long runway to reach you. So do you think, first of all, I'll ask about Dave Ramsey. Do you broadly think Dave Ramsey's advice of not paying $6 for coffee, not buying a home that you can't afford, not having credit card interest, do you think that's broadly good advice? And what do you make of this sort of like earning interest is dumb, but yet acquiring money through interest is dumb? So that's my start, and then we can get into the Keynesian stuff more broadly. If you want to go straight there, go for it. Swithin, thanks for doing this episode.
The basic financial advice is sound. That just seems obvious. Live within your means. That's kind of straightforward. I think Dave Ramsey on sort of earning interest, being against you paying interest but earning interest. I think, now I haven't listened, I've seen bits of him, so I don't know how consistent or nuanced he is. Also, as well, to note, given the context in which he's speaking, he may well have a more nuanced position than he seems to indicate, just because it's not relevant for whoever he is talking to. So I suspect Ramsey would, or at least a sensible version of Ramsey, for those who know as me, would do, is to effectively distinguish between interest generated from borrowings for like consumption and for investment. So if it was the case that you're borrowing for a consumer good, well, that's kind of a bad idea in most cases. You should probably wait. In those cases, it makes sense to defer gratification, save, and then buy it. However, if you are borrowing money for investment purposes, well, then that's different, because what you're doing is you're borrowing the money so that the funds that you have can create you even more money than you borrowed, which is not what your new TV will do for you that you bought on credit. So I think there really does need to be a very sharp distinction made between interest generated because you're basically lending out to firms rather than for just consumption. Now, would borrowing for consumption ever be justified? Maybe. I suppose. Even if you had a sane financial system, would people still borrow money to buy houses? Probably, just because they're so expensive to build. Assuming people bought them and they weren't just gifted, or the community built them or something like that. But insofar as a kind of like built for profit or whatever, probably you would still need to borrow at least some of it. You would need to borrow less. But even if the land was free, And then, I mean, this is one of the, you mentioned in sort of rent, and then that gets a very thorny issue of, what's just land ownership look like? If I imagine even you had sort of like an occupation and use sort of mutualist approach to land ownership, that if you occupied and used an area where you had a hut or something, you wanted to build a house, the probability that you would be able to finance that and build a house to modern standards without borrowing is probably quite low, even if average living standards rocketed in sort of the freed market or something like that. So I think you would do that. So in that case, I suppose you could say, well, insofar as there are things that you couldn't possibly buy without borrowing, and buying that thing is very important to living a good life, however you want to define it, then you could probably justify it. And I'm not sure what Ramsey would say on, I don't know if he takes like the Islamic position of sort of like no debt, although basically Islamic, and I'm no expert on Islamic finance and I don't remember the details, but they effectively reintroduce interest in a slightly different way. Although I think the lender and the borrower both need to take on risk in a way that the lender doesn't typically. As in, if the value of the property goes down, I think, or something, then the lender has, like the bank has a problem in a way that they don't if you just don't pay them back because they just repossess your house and sell it, and assuming that the value stays the same. So there's that, but I don't remember the exact details. But those have been my opening positions, thought on good interest, bad interest, and borrowing for consumption.
So my first question for you with it is my first statement is I'm using Dave Ramsey somewhat in the sense that like someone like Alasdair MacIntyre uses Nietzsche or Aristotle, in the sense that to some extent I'm using the real Dave Ramsey, and to some extent Dave Ramsey is a stand-in for sort of like normal bourgeois, conservative, centrist financial advice, or maybe not quite centrist, but like to some extent Dave Ramsey's I'm not really interested in hearing picking apart each piece of his body of work here. However, I'm using him in the standing. But your thing is, he would say that it's bad to take out a loan in general, first of all. But if you have to take out a loan, this seems to be the position. Taking out a loan for a house is okay, but taking out a loan for a vacation is not okay. Now, one of the firsthand thoughts reminds me of COVID, when we got into like who gets to decide what is a useful activity or a necessary activity and a non-necessary activity. Is going to a church service a necessary activity or not necessary activity? That's like the first thing that your distinction reminds me of, because plenty of houses include things like pools, billiard rooms, various other rooms. Like some people make their house into a very nice house. So like in some ways, when people buy a nice house, they're buying a house that they can spend quality time within. And second of all, when it comes to savings, and this goes to the broader macro view. If people save money, they typically don't save money in a gold vault. They don't buy gold bars. That's typically not what people are doing. And if you buy money in a gold fund, you're not that far off from what the stock market is. That's a slightly different issue. If you're saving money by like saving bags of rice in your basement, then I'd say you're actually saving, or saving gunpowder or something like that, or saving like actual like consumable bulk commodities. Then maybe you're in genuinely savings. But like oftentimes when people are saving, all they're doing is they're buying stocks with their savings in like mutual funds or something like that, or they're giving their money to a bank who in turn is doing the same thing. And what if you think about the macro outlook of what they're doing? So like when I save money, I'm well aware that let's say I buy Apple stock or Tesla stock. I would argue both Apple and Tesla stock are just basically consumer goods. No, you could argue people need a Tesla or need the newest generation of iPhone. I mean, I have a I have a Google phone that's a few years old. It's perfectly fine. But like, a la Dave Ramsey. But like, a lot of the goods people save, when the bourgeoisie, the conservative bourgeoisie, save, what they're really doing is they're just saving in or invest. They're really investing, but they're investing in the bourgeois consumerist economy, which in turn is dependent on people buying that new phone, buying that extra house, buying that vacation, and so forth and so forth. There was a funny video of one of Dave Ramsey's co-hosts at Disney World asking people how they afforded their trip and what they do. Some of the people did take out debt to go there. And like, if you ask their reasoning, it's actually maybe not super logical, but they'll say, well, I like going here. It gives me a reason to live, and it's something to look forward to. So I just took out debt to go do it. I think that's not that much different off of what people do for housing anyway. Now, you might say housing is a need, and in that sense, it is a need, but we don't live in the pure pre-modern economy. We live in this sort of modern or postmodern economy where we have all sorts of needs. And plenty of the people who make lots of money today make money on goods that people don't need by Dave Ramsey's own standards. Now, there is a thing where Dave Ramsey will say, eventually you should live like a king. But like, Dave Ramsey actually never goes, now, again, to his credit, like, he does live somewhat a sort of a mixture of an austere lifestyle and a decadent lifestyle. He's somewhere in the between in that sense. So, but interestingly, what hypocrisy means there is a very different thing, oddly enough, if consumerism is a good thing in that sense. So, Swithin, how would you differentiate between investment and consumption, and how does this play out in the broader economy? Isn't it the case that when you save, you're really just investing in capitalist corporations, stock market stocks, and then they are in turn sending out more consumer goods? Isn't this? And this is where my inroad into talking about Keynesian economics. And like, there's a canned question: is Keynes right? But like, I want like a sort of reevaluated version of that question. Is Keynes right now in regard to this conversation here? Swithin, what do you make of this?
Well, clearly, I mean, you're going to have to make some sort of value claim of what's important to a good life, what's not. Because, I mean, you could make the case that, if you have a projected good income and, you want to have a holiday and you want to have a really nice one, maybe while your kids are a particular age and you want to borrow to do it and you otherwise couldn't do it, then yeah, sure. So, I mean, a lot of this is going to be on individual basis. Now, what I think, and this kind of gets towards sort of the Keynesian thing, is why it seems odd, at least to me, to some extent, that individuals would be able to outbid firms on funds for borrowing. Because you would expect, in most cases, that firms would be willing to pay a higher rate of interest than an individual would for consumption, because he expects to get a monetary return from the investment. And so then that would increase the amount he's willing to bid. So I think the underlying question really is, with sort of Dave Ramsey and a lot of this stuff, is why is there so much consumer credit? Is it real credit, or is it just sort of fake credit because of the bizarre financial system that we have? And if you were to have, for instance, let's just say either 100% reserve, non-fractional reserve, gold standard, for instance, that Rothbard advocated, how much credit would there be? And then the question is, how much would people even be able to borrow to, how much would they able to borrow for consumption? Or would the relatively smaller amount of credit that would exist, well, note in this, in both positions, the argument is the amount of credit is basically the same. Well, in reality, in a sense, under the Rothbardian position, there's actually more credit available, genuine credit. It's just that there's lots of fake credit, and that causes misallocation and business cycles and whatever. But what it looks like, you would expect they would look like there was less credit. And then the question is, well, who would be the customer of the credit? So I think that's really the underlying one. I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, you can have different conceptions of what's good and what's bad. I mean, I think you bit deeper philosophical debates on, what's the good life, and also, happiness research. The interview I sent you was a bit dull to begin with, but like Arthur, was it Clark? Can't remember his name. But he looks at various things on like self-report happiness surveys and stuff, and to do things. So you go something like that. But your more fundamental question seems to be that, well, if everyone's sort of like saved and didn't spend, then what on earth would the economy look like, or could the economy even function? Which I understand to be your fundamental issue here.
Yes.
Is that
yes.
correct?
Yeah. That's a very good summation of my question.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's clear that the current economy in sort of like Dave Ramsey's ideal economy, or Rothbardistan, would be very different than what we currently have today. The question is, would it even be able to function? Well, I mean, you've clearly had economies, sort of like non-quote unquote capitalist economies, like pre-industrial economies that have run. So we can do that. So I suppose the question then would be, could we have the material standard of living, broadly speaking, that we have today, without having lots of consumer credit? So I would tend to say yes. You can, although you might expect me to say that. But the question of, is there demand for something is relevant. I mean, Keynes isn't entirely wrong about demand mattering. The problem with Keynes was that he either misunderstood or deliberately misinterpreted, or deliberately misunderstood, there's various options, Jean-Baptiste Say. So, as you may or may not be aware, there is something known as Say's law. Now, Keynes derided Say. I think it's in the general theory, or in other places as well, because he says that Say says that supply creates its own demand. And he understands this to mean that, well, it simply doesn't, demand doesn't matter. If you build it, they will come. And Keynes says, well, this is clearly false, because otherwise we wouldn't have recession, we wouldn't have depressions in this case. So clearly Say is wrong. And then Keynes goes to the other position and effectively severs the link between supply and demand in the macro level. So you look at A level or high school, late teens economics study that you might do in the US. I think the AP is like this. Just the macro is fundamentally Keynesian. You look at aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and aggregate demand is just completely severed from any concept of supply. Aggregate demand merely is the money supply multiplied by how many times the money is spent. That's literally all it is. It's a purely sort of monetary phenomenon, and it has no relationship whatsoever with actual physical supply. Now, the problem is this doesn't make any sense, because if you go to now you could say this is a micro view, but this is a more fundamental view, which is this, is that if you don't have anything to exchange with anybody, you can't make an exchange, and thus you can't demand anything. All you could do is steal, because you have to be able to trade something with somebody else so that the trade could take place. So you owning something constitutes demand for buying something else. So you need to So the idea that you can completely sever both supply and demand is absurd, because if you don't have anything to trade, all your option is stealing. And insofar as you don't steal and you do trade, well, then you can only demand things insofar as you own things, or at least you can provide services to people going into the future. So contrary to Keynes, supply is extremely important when it comes to demand. Now, with Keynes and in talking about, the depressions and stuff, I mean, really from the Austrian position is you get the unemployment and everything from the recession, basically because you have misallocation of resources because of the messing up with the financial system and interest rates and whatever. So that is to say that the supply in a sense creates its own demand, but not in the sense of they will build it and it will come. Then you will build it and they will come, but rather that constitutes genuine demand. You have to produce things to have genuine demand. The question then arises, well, what would anybody produce and then trade in such a society? Now, I think, just in a simple thing, if it's the case that you shouldn't go out for coffee and whatever, there's just going to be an increase in demand for home coffee production, and the supply of that goes up and you buy it. I mean, that's a relatively straightforward one. When it comes to cars, possibly if people don't, I think historically people didn't borrow to buy them as much. I think it's more of a case of the current market. For instance, government regulation has made cars way more expensive than they otherwise would be. In the UK, for instance, you cannot produce a new car unless it has a tire pressure monitor sensor. So you have to have an electronic sensor built into the car to say what your tire pressures are. Now, I don't know how expensive this is, but following sort of 2000 onwards, the government has required to make cars safer, which predominantly makes them heavier, and also to make them more fuel efficient because of warming. So that necessitated really complicated engine management systems to mean so they can reach the fuel economy requirements and also hit the crash test requirements, which had just made them more expensive. Now, if you had a freed market in cars, now again leaving aside who will build the roads, you could probably have some pretty darn basic cars built, which people could just buy with cash. Also, as well, if it was the case, what you tend to find is a lot of these places where people go out to consume, a lot of the employment is female in those cases. Well, it might well be the case that they're more profitably employed at home, or they have some other occupation there or do more things with their kids and they don't just go out. I mean, that's an entire possible, because if you treat, for instance, the post-war period as a sort of capitalist economy, it was kind of Keynesian, but it wasn't really financial capitalism that you kind of had from the 80s onwards. There's less borrowing, it's less financialized. You kind of had something like that. So, so you could sort of attempt to model it maybe in a post-war sense. So those are, I've been talking for a while now. Those are a few ways, at least I theoretically respond to Keynes, and then just a few practical examples of how things might change that would mean that you would be able to save. And this note, when I'm saying save it, I mean literally save under the bed, save. Not necessarily saving in stocks. That you're sort of building up a stock of funds so that you can buy something more expensive than you would typically be able to buy on a month-to-month basis. Hit whatever you see fit from whatever I've said.
I'll start with Keynes. I think Keynes is important, even if he's wrong. Keynes is important merely because elites took him seriously. And whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing is to some extent irrelevant. We treat this like the way a tiger consumes sheep, or not sheep, or a tiger consumes gazelles. I think MMTers are also interesting for the same reason, because I do think in like a surely prescriptive way that's the way the economy functions. The central bank prints money. Because one thing I noticed, there there was a boom in like motorcycle shops and bicycle shops during COVID because people would take their $1,500 checks, and what would they go buy? They would go buy these things now because they cost about that much. Now this was very good for things that cost about $1,500, so small dirt bikes, bikes, and things like that. That was a boom for those small consumer goods. It's quite clear that those things, those firms profited from those checks going out. Now, this is where when you think about how is the state able to do it? Well, the state was able to steal from the future money supply and debt and things like that. That was how the state created that money. Now, why was that money valuable? Well, the M&Ters say it pays tax. Now, this is the whole concept. This is the whole like framework of how we all, whether it's sort of like we all operate under this system. Maybe the North Koreans don't. Maybe the Russians operate under a slightly different system, but like to some extent, the whole world is somewhat on the U.S. system. Even the part of the world that doesn't want to be is on it again. And this is an inheritance from the British system, which wasn't as universal as partly because of technology. So when I think about the current existing economy, like what I as an individual do is I do like I follow a decent amount of Dave Ramsey advice on my personal side, but on my non-personal side, on like my investing side, like for example, I didn't do it, but like I think Pfizer stock pays a good dividend. That's one stock I could not morally bring myself to buy, even though it pays like a 7% dividend. I own tobacco stocks. I don't smoke tobacco, but it pays a good dividend. And these are sort of like vanilla things, like you have the Nancy Pelosi stock market tracker. If you buy defense companies, they tend to do well. So like one of the things that bothers me about the Dave Ramsey types is that like what is a good investment? And this is where I think the Marxists are at their most sound. Oftentimes, and you can get into like what would an ideal capitalist society look like versus what the current actual existing thing looks like. And that to me is a very worthy discussion. But to some extent, on a personal financial advice, what Ramsey, like the ideal financial thing is to have no debt and just have everyone else around you in debt to you. That's really like the perfect financial position. Like you have maximum leverage in that situation. But like I think that is fundamentally immoral to some extent. Like and even in some of the things that come up is you get into like discussions of inheritance, funnily enough, with wealthier people, but even people of like moderate means. Like how do you build wealth unless at some point you were given like a quote unquote chance to quote unquote get ahead? Because like if you're only ever earning exactly the amount of money that you need to survive, you by definition will never get above that level. So if the rent keeps going up every time your salary goes up, and prices keep going up every time your salary goes up, and if you do cut your spending, that's fine. So maybe that's how you get ahead. And this is where I think this is the side which anti-consumers Protestants like about capitalism. It forces people to be austere, which is fine, but then their goods themselves are paid in our modern economy are largely postmodern goods in the sense that we don't really need them. And I include things like healthcare. I also include things like the military-industrial complex as well. So what typically stands as a good air quote investment isn't really a good investment. I'm using good in a duplicitous manner. Moral good versus like good in terms of return on investment. Like for example, crypto. A lot of like your friends and your sort of Austrian friends will laugh at crypto, but like crypto has been to me one of my best investments ever. Way better than buying General Motors or buying some other stock. And again, I knew about this when I was in high school. I should have bought more. I just bought like $20 worth. It was my best investment ever, in some sense. Do I think crypto is morally good? I think it's probably more morally good than Pfizer is or Raytheon. But like those are good investments, Pfizer. And if you do think Bitcoin is just like a scam, so like I think Ramsey doesn't fully think in a holistic way about his financial advice, and that's partly what I wanted to somewhat talk about. The stuff about Say's law about demand, that's really interesting. To some extent, to use the lame statement, that's above my pay grade. Although I basically understand what you're saying, in that regard, 100%. But although this the thing I oftentimes think about social science is if you take do the theories themselves change the reality? Like, so if you observe a star moving or observe fish moving, they won't change their behavior. But if you tell people humans, like if you say, well, every day you do this, why do you do this? Like we humans are conscious. So like anytime I think about economic laws or political scientists have tried to generate laws about laws in the sense of the physics version of laws of like why do states go to war or when does a riot become a revolution? They try to develop a theory with laws. I think in the social scientists, the laws are always at minimum lowercase l. Because there's this way in which water always flows downhill unless there's something bringing it up. It never doesn't do that. Unless there's zero gravity or unless there's some other factor. So in that way, all of these sort of economic laws aren't capital L laws. That's where Hayek physics envy. That's my comment on the Sayers discussion. But I want to go back to the good versus good. I do think there is a certain sense which the best advice is somewhat have everyone be buy predatory payday loans or something like that. That's good financial advice for the payday loaner, not for the person taking out the loan, but for the payday loaner. That's a great interest. Then you can save. So Swithin, what do you make of this? And what do you make of my discussion about laws with a capital L and lowercase l? Do you think those laws are this is more of a general discussion of the social science? Our social science is true science, and should we care? And whether true science is true science anyway? There's a equally case, but we'll stick to vanilla movements of objects. And second of all, do you think there's a good versus good problem for Dave Ramsey?
I do think they are kind of capital L laws. I think diminishing margin utility, for instance, would be one. Say's law or something would be one. I mean, you could say it depends over the definition of words in certain respects. What counts as an exchange? Is it really an exchange? I know because you could specify lots of conditions of what will count as a genuine voluntary exchange. But I mean, I suppose you don't even say it's a voluntary exchange. Well, then you could say it's So I mean, you're going to get problems like that. But I mean, given the fact that you agree on what counts and the conditions that count for a voluntary exchange, insofar as any of those have ever existed, they would require someone to own something so that they could give that up in exchange for something else. So I think that's true. Same with diminishing margin utility. I think that's the case. Now with the sort of the good versus the good or the bad or whatever and financial decisions, I mean, this is kind of getting into I don't remember the details very much, but it gets into sort of discussions of in sort of Catholic moral philosophy of material and formal cooperation. So it's like there's a discussion by one theologian, I think in the Middle Ages. I can't remember what it's called. It's something in the ladder. The army leader is going to rape or have sex with a woman or something, and then do you give him the ladder to climb up or not? And is helping him have the ladder, is that morally permissible or not? So it sounds like we're getting to these kind of discussions. And if you want to say that, well, you are materially, so the difference between material and formal cooperation would be, with formal cooperation, you kind of agree with the end. Whereas material cooperation is, well, you're just providing them the means by which for them to achieve the end, even though you might disagree with the end. So, for instance, if you sell someone a gun and they go and kill somebody, it doesn't necessarily follow from that you are formally cooperating with them. Now, you could argue, well, if you knew that they were going to do it and whatever, them specify under certain conditions, but per se, that would just be mere material cooperation. And then there's like remote material cooperation and proximate. Is that the word they use? I can't remember. So I think you're getting things like that. But I would agree that under the current financial system, it does kind of require you to compromise yourself in certain respects to hold the value of your money. So I, broadly speaking, follow what was he called? Harry Brown's permanent portfolio, which is an even split between stocks, bonds, cash, and gold. But I add crypto in there, well, basically Bitcoin as well. So I have an account which covers basically all the companies in the FTSE stock exchange. One of those, for instance, is Bet365, which probably isn't a particularly great company for society as a whole. Individual on certain things, gambling, yeah, is that really an issue? No, probably not. But they make a lot of money. And interestingly, its own, well, I think it was inherited by the daughter, but she's the CEO, and she's the best paid CEO in England. Well, one count, one year, £365 million. So, yeah, I mean, it does require you to compromise yourself to some extent, but I think that's just kind of living in the world. And I don't really, and then also individually, are you really making that much difference? To each of them, maybe not. Then I suppose you say it's a collective action problem. I suppose you could go there. But yeah, I think that's really where your question is going, is sort of like material and formal, and when does material cooperation become sort of morally problematic, I think. So I mean, so for example, just a hypothetical, not a financial related one would be, suppose that nobody else had a ladder in this rate case, I think it is. And well, you just lent him the ladder and you knew what he was going to do, but you kind of disagree with it, then that's kind of close material, and the fact the other guy doesn't have any other way of getting a ladder, just suppose, then generally speaking, that's considered morally impermissible because you are providing a route to it. Whereas if there was loads of ladder sellers or whatever, and he was going to get it anyway, well, he might as well get it from you, and then material wouldn't be an issue. I mean, you can debate whether those are good distinctions or not, but that's at least a way of thinking about things with this.
The conversation about remote material and cooperation is, again, that's I don't mean this as a defense. That's one of your core. That's, as I observe you discussing with you. That's one of your core like answers to things, is the remote material cooperation. And I think that's one of the ways in which Christianity, whether you think it's true or not, even if we just view it as just lore or something like that, it's just as a folk legend. If you want to just view Christianity, if we take the atheist versus theism question, one of the ways in which Christianity bears out in the modern world is people break down the remote material cooperation. This has been the thing that we've done, especially the past 300 years, or more broadly over the 2,000 years, is that like we have made things that used to be considered evil now illegal, but then on vice versa, we have things like mutually assisted suicide now too. Although I would argue we do it for oddly enough, it's done for like the the suicide cells that you can get in like Switzerland and now the Canada. It's arguably done for it oddly enough is done for Christian reasons anyway, or at least liberal ones, and liberalism originates from Christianity, a kind of reduction of harm. So like my problem for Ramsey is like, you can say that you don't have much control over investing in Bet365. If you work, you have a pension or something like that, they're going to invest whether you want it or not. And that's fine. I think on some level that answers the problem well enough. Like I think that's well enough. I just think that to some extent the role of both intellectuals, or thinking people, private thinking persons like ourselves, is to go further than the good enough level. And in sort of the virtuous, just living a good life. Like I think you have to go more, or you have to be better than just good enough. So I would say the remote material cooperation is, sure, that functions on some level, but I think people should try to be better than that. So like during COVID, like if you had maybe 4 baskets of people, you had a basket number of one, which is people willingly going along, and not only going along, telling others to go along, and so forth. And then you had people all the way on the other side, like myself and you, actively opposing it, as much as you can. And then you had the muddled middle. I think when it comes to these matters, like for example, like I did wear a mask when I flew on an airplane and went through TSA security, because like I'm not gonna, like, that's, am I making COVID more likely? But yeah, well, I would be just arrested if I tried to go on a plane without a mask in 2020. Maybe I shouldn't have flown. So the remote material cooperation there is like, it works on one level, but then I do think at some point we as individuals, or we, and again, I know we as a society is always a dubious term, but that's how things change. So like if we ever get a freed market, I think we'd get it by slowly unwinding non-virtuous behavior, or non-virtuous as to the individual sees them. So I'm perfectly fine if, like, oddly enough, it could be that the people consuming Bet365's products are enjoying themselves. I mean, that's like the libertines, like libertines reason, like they might actually think that's a good thing, spending all their money on, games and sports gambling. Maybe they're actually truly happy. So maybe that's the way to answer Dave Ramsey. However, I don't think Dave Ramsey actually thinks that. Now, maybe Dave Ramsey is actually a live and let live guy. And maybe that really is his case, a live and let live capitalist. But that's another area which I think the quote unquote culture has a problem, where I would just argue that we have to do a little better than that. Yeah, it's true that you're not legally responsible because your money is being invested there. Sure, that's the case. But like, should you give that ladder to that guy who wants to go up to that bedroom? I mean, maybe Oscar Wilde would say, yeah, you should give that ladder to that guy. But like, there is a question where, well, what should we do? What should we actively do? And that's where I would say that, I invested in crypto, for example, because I thought it was a thing that increased human freedom. And maybe it's just all going to be bought by BlackRock. It's all just a scam. And it made me money. So in that sense, it was the perfect investment. Like Boeing to me is a good investment for the same reason. It's generally a good investment. And I actually do use their products. When I fly, I do use their products. Whether, like, if we had this freed market, we're going to have lots of small-time investors who have to think through these decisions. And they can't just say, well, leave this up to the hedge fund manager or leave this up to the manager. I think that's kind of thinking we need to sort of get away from. But so then, thanks. I mean, if you want to continue, you're more than welcome to on this discussion. But that's somewhat is at the end of my interest here. Do you have any further thoughts on my discussions of not just? I mean, I think it's a good answer, but like being better than just good, like great. Should you actively give that ladder to that guy? I mean, should you actively invest in Bet 365, even if it has a great return? Isn't that just like ripping people off?
I don't know. It's very difficult to say, and you have it. But I suppose also as well. I mean, when you come to public limited companies, you have the problem of divorce of ownership and control. I mean, you don't really have any active control over how the company runs. Yes, of course, you can vote in meetings and stuff, but that's about it. You can't really have any direct control over the company. And so, well, yeah, you could say, should you make any money? But then the question is, should you make money on anything? So it's, I mean, so I could see someone objecting to investing individually in Bet365. Whether you have an account which covers the whole of the stock market, then it's like only part of it. As I say, I don't know. It's difficult. What I would say is, I would suspect it's interesting. I mean, whether you would get more or less equity finance in like a less financialized economy is an interesting question, because it does seem to be the case that people just care about like the pure monetary returns insofar as they're just like passive investors. And when they're actually actively involved in the companies, then they seem to concern themselves more with what the companies actually do. So to this end, there was like Shark Tank, Dragon's Den in England, and there was a guy called Duncan Bannatyne who was on there, and one guy was trying to sell this device that basically read bedtime stories to the children, and Duncan Bannatyne was not happy. He was like, "That's your job. It's your kid. You should read him in bed, not having it." And he got really angry and said he was out. He wasn't investing, because he was like, "That's an immoral product." He wasn't investing in it. Now, in that case, he probably would have had a more active role in the company, because it was like he probably would have had some influence over the running of it. Whether he would have cared if it was part of his portfolio, I don't know. But what it does speak to, I think, is that if you are more directly involved in whatever the business is, you seem to care more about what it does rather than it just makes money. At least that's how it seems to me to be the case. But yeah, I think your question is a more general one of how can you act morally in an immoral world, I suppose, is the way I would describe that. But now I thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibshow@gmail.com.